Thank you all so much for coming. I'm just sort of gobsmacked to see a full room. Just a brief sort of discussion about what's going to happen. I'm going to run a short slideshow that's going to repeat images. And then I'm going to switch to a different slideshow, which is not actually a slideshow, it's just a presentation. So you'll see computer images in between. Right, where does it?
We're trying to get full view.
No, got it. Right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play the slideshow for you while I read a short excerpt from an online conversation that I'm having with a man named Nigel from an arts platform called Point and Line. And the premise of this platform is exactly for this, for the discussion of artworks that are uploaded to the space. And this conversation is happening currently on a work that I have there. And it just happens to be a discussion about the work that I'm using for the exhibition that's happening in January in Ruskin Gallery. So, here we go. Nigel says, I'm intrigued by the kind of emerging genealogical relationships between the works in your practice and the ontology of creative expression in play when you refer to the immateriality of being. I respond, Nigel, thank you so much for this intensely interesting discussion. First, let me address your question about ontology. What does it mean for an artwork to come into being? How can the application and organization of materials express the essence of being and existence? When is an artwork a synthesis of a life's experience and all the belief systems, both accepted and rejected, involved in that experience? When is it not? Does time mark the only measure of distance between an artist and the artwork? What can a distance imply? Is there ever any actual distance? And what exists in the gap of that distance, if it is there? And to engage your recent question about your own work, what is an artist seeing? These may appear to be obvious questions with even more obvious answers. But I think these are the questions that are at the center of my practice and my ontology of creative expression, as you call it. From these questions, perhaps the genealogical relationships become apparent and possibly gives an insight into what I mean by the immateriality of being. I would argue this is not the materiality of a painting, but the immateriality of being made material, while at the same time, I think it raises questions of the notion of materiality as a physical construct. Nigel says, I'm spotting a problem with the point and line format. Should I be posting under versions matrix or token? Or maybe it's an effect of your practice to make fixing on a single work difficult, to feel the curatorial ground splitting and dividing with each iteration. I respond, I'd like to think it's the effect of my practice which makes fixing on a single work difficult. And if that's the case, that's a very great compliment indeed. As you mentioned curating, this is an important element of auto-curation which holds significance for me, this idea of division, or perhaps more to the point, subdivision. It's not an idea of division as separation, but more like division as reduction. Let me explain that. As an artist curator, it's my job to curate my work either on its own or in conjunction with other artists' work. In order to do this, I must consider the totality of my production and make decisions on where I can isolate images from the context of their making. Removing them from their set, immediately initiating the conditions that they then represent all of those other pieces which cannot be represented within the scene of the exhibition. In all reality, these are not decisions that can be made with any rationale or logic. They're decisions of chance, in that I realize it's equivalent to a throw of the dice. The throw happens, a choice is made. The dice tumble, all unrepresentable associations take effect. The dice fall back from the throw. The work takes its place in the exhibition as member, as placeholder, as emblem, as isolate. The message of the work is no longer just the readable visual, it's all of these things separately and at once. It's the significance of all these things that poses the question, what does it mean for an artwork to come into being? So while separation happens in making the choice to exhibit a work, actually what is happening is a distillation and a reduction, or maybe a realigning, of meaning associated with the work. I see this as uniquely happening within artist-curator practice. In light of this, it makes complete sense that you would have difficulty fixing on one work. And just as I switch, bear with me. Right. When I started preparing for this presentation, selecting these images and thinking about what I was going to talk about, I invariably start asking myself questions, and they always center around the word what. So, like, what is going on? But in selecting these images, these questions, just what is it about these images? What's happening in the translation and the transformation? And what's happening moving from the singular image to the multiple? I think what's happening is visualizing the unseen. It's imaging the latency of the individual working within multiplicity. The individual does not retain individuality with work like this, but through this kind of replication, there's a sense of the influence of the individual on the network, and likewise, the influence of the network on the individual. So this idea of individual, it's not something really that should be understood as we generally understand the idea of individual. That is a singular personality or a presence or an ego. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an individual as a unique point of reference. And it's from this unique point of reference, if you zoom out from that point of reference, you then see a network and lots of individual points of references in a context, in a network, in a matrix. When I look at my work, I don't see an individual artist's vision. What I see is this translation of going from this unique singular position to the networked position. So going from the individual to the multiple. I think my work is a visual depiction of that transmutation from the individual to the matrix, going from the singular thoughts to connections and contingent influences. These positions, I'm quite convinced, are not static, but fluid, changing, self-replicating, and sparking. For reasons, I think, that are very visible in these examples, I feel that this relationship between the individual and the network is a significant one. They influence each other and they shape each other, but they don't define or limit each other. They resonate with each other. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur describes this view of self in his book, One Self as Another, where he talks about the self as a singular totality. And that's exactly what he's describing. He's describing the self, which is a unique point of reference in a larger matrix and a larger network of connections and contingencies. Paul Ricoeur is not the first person to describe the self in this sort of way. Donna Haraway in the 80s, in a seminal essay in her book, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, discussed this idea of situated knowledge. And that's exactly what she's talking about, a single point of reference within a larger matrix. And also, in the beginning of the earliest 20th century, the literary philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin describes this as well. He talks about the Dialogic Principle, which is this very sort of thing, talking about a self that is relative to every other self and every other position around it. And when he was talking about his idea of the dialogic principle, he was very much talking about and responding to Einstein's theory of relativity, which was just coming into parlance at that time. So this idea of this sort of unique but networked self is not a new idea of self by any means. My doctoral research asks what the relationship might be between autobiography and simulacra, and how that relationship might affect views of self in artist-curator practice. This view of self as a singular totality, I feel, is really important to artist-curator practice, because that's exactly the way artist-curators function. There is a singular view, and there is a wider view that deals with context and other contingencies, other sort of relationships. This idea of autobiography comes into play as well, because I believe that all artwork is autobiographical, or at least has an autobiographical element to it. I see no way to reduce or to get away from the reality that any author who authors something or creates something reflects who they are, or their ideas, their tastes, their views. All of those things are imbued in the artwork, whether or not the artwork is intended to be autobiography or not. And then this question of moving between the singular and the multiple, it seems to me that there has to be some way to make that transition. And I feel that simulacrum is the thing that facilitates moving from the singular position to the networked position. And the idea of simulacrum that I'm dealing with is a Deleuzian view, which looks at simulacra as a positive motivator of change, as opposed to the generally accepted view from Baudrillard, which looks at simulacrum as really quite a negative, sort of a hyper-real fantasy situation where essentially death and destruction comes about. So in the Deleuzian view, he's looking at in this idea of a positive motivator of change. He says that it's not just an idea of copies, so thinking of the simulacrum is not just an idea of copies, but it's an idea of something that is a difference of a difference, or in other words, something that carries the potential for change within it. And if you think about that, that's nearly everything. So my artwork generally explores this idea of self as both a unique and networked position, and it also questions how replication manifests as change, and it makes a visual expression of this Deleuzian idea of the simulacrum as a positive motivator of change. Earlier this year, in the summertime, the PhD students were given some studio time, and I was very fortunate to be able to get to work in that fantastic painting space at the end of Ruskin Gallery. And this is one of the pieces that I made in that session. And what I did during that studio session was not to work in the usual sort of way where I was re-imaging, resampling, remaking older work. But what I did was really to sort of work on some new ideas, still within these concepts of simulacrum and this networked, this unique and networked self. However, this piece was actually, or is actually, based on a work that I did in the springtime in the basement gallery, where Kelsey Davenport, Gemma Marmalade, and Denise Johns and I had an exhibition. And if you're familiar with the space downstairs, you know there are two corridors to the gallery space. And Gemma and I were situated in the first corridor, and Kelsey and Denise were in the second corridor. And I felt that I really wanted to make a visual sort of connection in my installation that would move into Kelsey's video installation around the corner. What I did in that space was I created a fictional autobiography of the wall while I was researching sort of the elements, breaking apart autobiography and researching the elements of what goes into creating autobiography. And the image that I sort of latched onto in Kelsey's installation was an image of cuneiforms from Syria. An artifact that I just absolutely love. I love the texture, the patterns. It fascinates me that this can be writing and language, because I can't read it and I can't imagine how anyone else could, but they are just stunningly beautiful. So what I did in this piece, in the piece that was in the installation, was to think of language in that way, as a visual, as opposed to a language that carries meaning and is readable. So what I did was I mimicked the motions of cursive writing, and you know, nothing was readable in this, but it carried that sense of perhaps there was something that could be readable from it. And when I did that installation, I knew that I wanted to make that piece into a full-scale painting, which is what this is. And in fact, this is just a section of the painting. The painting itself is a vertical, and it's quite large. It's about 2.5 meters. And this covers the whole surface of the painting. And it's quite simple. It's just black and white paint on raw canvas. And one of the things that surprised me so much in this painting when I finished it was the tonal variation and the tonal values that became apparent. And also the other thing that I really love about this is that there's no background and foreground. It's compressed, and everything is on the same surface, on the same layer, even though visually it's dense and it feels like you could get in there and just rummage around. This is called cursive, by the way. This piece, which some of you have seen in person, was also made at the same time. This is called Invisible Agitation. And just previous to the studio provision that we had was our PhD exhibition in Ruskin. And in that exhibition I did an installation where I made actual autobiographical work based on an image of myself as a child. And as I was working on actual autobiography, I thought one of the things I needed to do was to address another element of the simulacrum that I was researching and I'd uncovered in my studies. This was an idea from Pierre Klasowski, who was a French novelist and older brother to the artist Balthus. And his idea of a simulacrum was that the simulacrum is invisible agitation. And what he meant by that was sort of interior impulses and compulsions that affect attitudes and behavior and outward appearances very like Freudian psychoanalysis. He calls this invisible agitation the phantasm. And I felt, as I say, since I was working on autobiography, I needed to confront my own invisible agitations. So what this says is, my invisible agitation is time, the anxiety that I will have lost my chance to make something of time. C keeps asking me, what drives you to make this work? That's it. I'm obsessed with the fear that I will lose time, knowing that every day I lose time. This is also a fairly long piece of rice paper, and what I did, I copied that sort of short statement several times down the page, and then I went over the handwriting and repeated the handwriting several times, so that's about 8 repetitions. And what I thought would happen by this point was that I thought that the words and the handwriting would obliterate itself and it would completely merge. And it didn't do that, to my surprise. It did in some areas, but mostly what's happened is that the form of the word, even though it's not readable, it has retained its shape. And I found that significant for the simulacrum, because that's exactly what happens. Meaning will change, meaning will disappear with the simulacrum, but the form will persist. And I found that just really significant. These pieces were also made at the same time in the same studio session. They are as yet untitled. And what this is, it's just kitchen paper, or as we say in America, paper towel. And these are sort of curious pieces. In a way, they're finished, but in a way, they're not finished by any means. When I moved to Cambridge a little over a year ago, I had the idea that I would work on building an archive of objects and furnishings, adornments, personal adornments, that reminded me of my grandmother. And what I wanted to do was to put together an installation that would recreate my view, my memory, my feelings of my grandmother. And the curious thing about this is that all of these pieces that I were collecting, they had absolutely nothing to do with me or my grandmother or our history at all. But what I was doing by choosing these objects was that I was imposing an operational rule that said my grandmother would have had this. So linking my memories to the simulacrum through this rule of my grandmother would have had this meant that I was collecting all these objects together that were surrogates. Surrogates for my memory, surrogates for my experience, surrogates for who I knew my grandmother to be, surrogates for our life together. And what this represents, the pieces that I did purchase and the furnishings that I did buy, they were secondhand, so obviously they needed to be cleaned, and that's just all this is the dust and the muck and the grime from this furniture. When I did this motion of cleaning, and when I actually cleaned these pieces, I felt that this was an actual work, because what I was doing was I was imbuing all of my memories and all of these sort of concepts that I had of my grandmother, all of these images that I had of her, into the process of cleaning these pieces of furniture. So I was, in a way, sort of situating those objects to my memory and bringing them into the fold of this larger context of the experience and the relationship I have with my grandmother. even though it was performative, even though I didn't perform it, and I don't consider it performative because no one was there to witness me. I just did this on my own as a very quiet, contemplative, sort of reflective action. You notice the bits of gold in both these pieces and the previous work. The gold is also significant and is showing up quite a lot in my work at the moment. My grandmother was a musician, and she played both piano and harp. She had a baby grand piano and a beautiful gilt leaf Lion and Healy harp. And when I was a very young child, I have no idea where this came from, but I had this obsession with sticking things. So bits of Scotch tape, little stickers. Someone thought it was a good idea to give me a label maker one year for Christmas, and I made all these labels, stuck them all over the house. I just was obsessed with sticking things. So, of course, I stuck some Scotch tape to the crown of my grandmother's gold leaf harp. Not knowing anything about that or what that would do, I just was claiming it as like, this is mine. And I did, in fact, inherit her harp when she died. My grandmother, of course, being the wise woman that she was, she never removed that tape. But several years later, I was embarrassed that that tape was there. And so I took it off and, of course, removed the gold leaf from the harp and was mortified that I had done that. So the gold leaf that's showing up in the work is sort of a visual, invisible agitation, just as the words were in the previous work. Also, what I'm doing in these two pieces, where the gold appears, they are holes and tears that have happened in the paper. And I'm sort of appropriating the Japanese art of kintsugi, and which looks at repairing or practices repairing pottery with precious metals. It's a philosophy as well as an art practice, and I find the philosophy of this really beautiful. In this philosophy, the idea that an object newly made is not beautiful, and in fact it has no existence, it has no history, it's not yet come into being. And it's only when the object is broken and repaired that it then comes into being, and it has an existence, it has a history, and it takes its place as an object which has an identity and a presence. So that's sort of how I'm working with it here as well. So moving into my curatorial practice, these are images from my first case study, which happened last September, and it's a solo exhibition where I curated my own work. This was at a gallery called Art House 1 in London. And one of the most significant things, one of the most difficult things I deal with curating my own work is actually separating my work from its context. So engaging with not only what's visible, but what's unrepresentable. And to give you an idea of what that context is, what I mean by the work that, removing it from its context, the works that I just talked about from the studio production in the summer, all of those works are using different ideas, different concepts, different materials, but they were all made at the same time, under the same conditions, in the same place, sort of in the same context. So I feel that they are a set. Likewise, all of these pieces also have a set. So they represent bodies of work that aren't necessarily a series, but pieces that were made at the same time, in the same location and under the same conditions. So just like with the network of multiplicity, where I talked about in the beginning with the idea of the self as a singular position and a networked position, and the interior compulsions as well, the invisible agitations. What's unrepresentable in the scene has as much impact as what's visible. Often people come up to me and tell me that they sense that there's something deeper going on in the work. They don't know what it is, they can't really define it, they can't really even name it or put it into language, but they have a sense that there's something deeper going on. This tells me that that is the impact of the unrepresentable within the scene. As an artist curator, I feel it's my task to engage with both this visible and the unrepresentable. And one of the ways that that happens is by visualizing conceptual frameworks and melding concepts together. So this was an installation that happened during the same exhibition, the solo exhibition last year. And it's called Enigma Wall installation. And what this represents, there's a span of time here. So these are 3 different works from 3 different groups or bodies of work, 3 different concepts. The small work is probably the oldest. That was about 2007, 2008. And what I was looking at in that body of work was an idea of a concept of anti-gesture. So it was this idea of working with gesture, but not in sort of a highly emotional or psychological way as the abstract expressionists, but using gesture as a way to signify presence alone. And that's in fact what this is. It simply is a gesture that is frozen in time. It is captured in that paint. This piece then, I made that about 2010, 2011. And I had moved on from this concept of anti-gesture, and I was looking at, I was sort of wondering what painting might look like if I combined late modernism with postmodernism. And this piece in particular uses sort of the brushstrokes of Mark Rothko, while also looking at a play with perception of Frank Stella, the post-painterly abstract artist Frank Stella. And if you know his painting, Die Van Hoek, which I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, it's German, and again, loosely translated, as I understand it, it means flags on high, which was the marching song for the Third Reich and the Nazis. And what this painting is, I'm sure you've seen it, large black painting, and it has 4 quadrants that makes a cross, and it looks like pinstripe painted on a black ground. But in fact, what's significant about that painting is that the pinstripes are not paint, but it's the raw canvas that comes to the foreground. The black paint is actually what's on the foreground, but it recedes into the back. And it's difficult to see in this projection, unfortunately, but if you could see this painting in real life, a similar sort of thing happens with perception. What looks like is on the surface is in fact the background, and what is on the surface in fact looks like it's in the background. So this area is just raw canvas, and the black is painted over it. And then at the top, this is actually white acrylic paint that is painted on top of the black. And the white paint recedes whereas the raw canvas looks like it sits on the top of the canvas. The title of that work is We're No Longer Seeing, But Reading, which is a quote from Deleuze. And what he was talking about was this idea that we no longer really are using our perceptions in order to communicate or to see our surroundings, to actually be in our surroundings. But what we're doing is reading signs and reading symbols. And as you can imagine, that can lead to a lot of confusion and misrepresentation and misreadings. So finally, the background then is Enigma wallpaper. And this is actually printed in 6 sections of wallpaper. And this may be the most complicated bit to it, because this is already sort of a temporal kind of transition. What this is a hyper-replication of the small painting. And the painting, as I said, was in 2008. In 2013, I was working on a project, an Arts Council funded project called This Me of Mine. And within that project, I was collaborating with another artist named Sandra Crisp, and we were working with a creative programmer named Louis Marcuse, and we were putting together an interactive program where people could draw on the touch screen, and with these implements, the brushes in the program, they were filled with the patterns that Sandra and I had created for the program. And this was one of the tiles that I had done, which was just this quadrant here. So it went from the painting to the tile, and then last year it has turned into the wallpaper in this hyper-replication. And what you see actually here is the actual thought process progression as I designed, and as I sort of questioned and tested myself, pushing myself to come up with new ways to configure that original sort of element to create new designs. All of this is related to Nietzsche's eternal return, the idea that everything returns, and also the Deleuzian becoming. And in fact, I'm reading Nietzsche and Philosophy by Deleuze at the moment. And he gives a really interesting discussion about the eternal return and this idea of becoming. And just a quick little snippet. Deleuze says, returning is the being of that which becomes. And Nietzsche says, that everything recurs is the closest approximation of a world of becoming to a world of being. Then in summation, Deleuze says, in the eternal return, it's not being that returns, but rather the returning itself that constitutes being. And that phrase is really important to my practice, the returning itself that constitutes being. So, all of these elements together, which is a very complex thing, all of this together, this installation becomes an expression of a self that changes in time, uncertain of its beginning or ending, with unreliable perceptions, and a body which disappears within its own representation of itself. And finally, because the very nature of artist-curator practice is to engage with one's own work, it involves a temporal disruption. So there's a constant forward and backward looking at sort of old ideas, new ideas, expressions, contexts. As a result, temporal striations often happen, like mirrors reflecting each other. There's an echo that happens. We live in an age of image profusion, and the idea, the simulacra is actually just, it's everywhere, impacting on our perceptions in ways that we don't really, that we're not really aware of. A significant part of my research is actually trying to uncover the ways that the simulacrum impacts on us, not just in the sense of repetitions and copies, but more significantly in actions and within space and location. What I've discovered so far about the simulacrum is that the artist-curator can work with the simulacrum in two ways. First, working behind the scenes as a model initiating change within the simulacrum, or as exposed as an object of the simulacrum consumed by my own referent. The duality of the artist-curator as what I call I-artist and I-curator, speaking with different voices, means that this shift happens in going from position to position within the space of the exhibition, and there must be a placeholder as that transition happens. For me, the simulacral self is the placeholder. It's the transient self whose only concern is to shape the moment of its appearance. Thank you.